In this video, I'm going to go through the entire process of setting up VerbaGPT for the first time and asking a question of three different types of situations. So one CSV file, um, an online cloud SQL database, and then also a local SQL installation that might be on your machine or on your network, etc. So the first thing to do is to download VerbaGPT, and you fill out the form and you get a download link. It's a pretty small download. It's a zipped file, about a megabyte. And I've already downloaded it, and it's on my desktop. And this is what it looks like. It has a few files in it, including requirements. So in order to set up VerbaGPT for the first time, you have to fire up Python. So the way I would recommend doing it is using Anaconda Navigator. So you set up a new environment. So you can create an environment over here as that kind of keeps things isolated. And then you can click this button, open terminal. So I have a terminal open here, and you can enter this command. And this is, by the way, these instructions are also on the download page itself. So you can copy paste the command too if you want. So pip install our requirements txt. It might take a few minutes for it to run through. Since I've already downloaded these packages, it's quick for me. And then I'm going to fire up VerbaGPT by typing this command, python verbagpt.py. And it takes a few moments. And I'm working here on the laptop, and it should open up a window on my browser here using Chrome. And there we have it. It's running now. And the first thing to do when you fire up VerbaGPT is to enter your OpenAI key. So you do that by going to the Options tab and entering the key and then saving it. So you only have to do it once, and then it should remember it the next time. And there's also another option to use Bing, and there's instructions for that on the download page itself. I recommend using OpenAI. I think that's going to be a much better approach, much more consistent. So Bing is technically going to be free for you, but OpenAI, especially Model 3.5, is so economical. And the way VerbaGPT uses it is fairly efficient. So that's the path that I would go down. I think in the future, one of the things I want to do is to add like a local model option here, so that, but that's in the future. So right now we only have these two options here, OpenAI and Bing. Okay, so going back to the data tab, let's do our first exercise. Let's use some CSV data, and I'll click on CSV. So now I can drop a file in here. And I'm going to go, there's some sample data that comes in the folders. So you go to a folder called VG underscore, and then there's sample data. So I'm going to pick one of these data called abalone, kind of drop it in here. And it shows us the first few rows of the data. And, one of the columns of interest is this rings column. So let's say I want to ask a question about that. So I'm going to go to the talk page. It tells me what it's connected to, abalone.csv, and it's using GPT 3.5 Turbo. I'm going to ask a question. Give me a histogram for rings. That's more of an instruction than a question, but the hope here is that it's going to write some Python code that will help me generate a histogram for rings. So here in this first window, we have our chat going, and it gives us a response, and the code portion of this gets pulled into here in this window. And this is editable, so I can edit it and change things if I want to. And once I can review it. If it doesn't look right, I can make corrections. And then once I'm satisfied, I can execute it. And there we have it. We have our histogram for rings. Okay. Well, let's go back. And let's go to a different section. So there's another section called Curated here. So the idea here is that we have some data sets that are available if you want to, that are online, that are on Azure cloud, that you can play with. So if you don't want to use your own SQL, you don't have access to it. I mean, there's some data sets here that you can explore how LLMs can work with a relational database. So, for example, I can connect to this database called Student Management System. And this is how that data is organized. So there are courses, there are credits, there are students. I mean, you can read more about this on the Microsoft webpage if you search for this data, Student Management System data. And the same thing, I can go to the talk page, and now it's telling me it's connected to that data, GPT 3.5. I'm going to clear the chat and ask it a question. How many students take calculus? So the hope here is that it's going to write some code that is basically write a SQL query. So the first thing it writes a SQL query, and then we can further manipulate that output in Python. So, well, the whole thing is Python, but it's kind of a combination, which is nice because if it was only Python, then you're kind of limited in what you can do. Sorry, if it was only SQL, you're limited, but since it's Python, you can kind of do more than that. Okay, so we're getting our first error, and it's saying that there's an ambiguous column called student ID. So let's see what's going on. So here we have student ID, but the student ID is actually in two tables, credit and S. So which one do we want? So I'm going to fix this by doing that. And let's see if it fixes the error or not. Okay, so there are 79 students taking calculus. So this is good, because this kind of shows us that these LLMs, and I am using 3.5, if you use 4.0, that probably would be better, but it is a lot more expensive. But even with 4.0, I think you're going to encounter scenarios where the code that's generated is not perfect. So that's why it's kind of nice to be able to edit it and rerun it. And I'll talk at the end about where I see this technology going and what the current limitations are. But clearly, this is one of the limitations right now, that the code generates errors on execution, and then you have to troubleshoot. Okay, let's go to another option, which is using SQL data. And you can either enter your Azure SQL if you have something on Azure on the cloud, or you can switch to local SQL. Okay, so here I'll switch to local SQL. So I have on my laptop, I have an instance called instance of a server that's named thus, and it has a few tables in it. But before I can use my local data, we want to add the schema to we want to provide the schema to the LLM so that it can generate useful queries. So let's see how we can do that. So the way to do that is you go back, and there's a folder called CSVs. Okay, so once again, you go back to the main folder. There's a folder called VG underscore. Within it is called CSVs, and within it is this file, create embeddings. This is the file you want to edit. So if you open the file, the way it's organized is it has source column, database, table name, column name, data type, value, and a note level and notes. So the idea here is that we provide the LLM this information. So the neat thing about VerbaGPT is that this is not hosted in the cloud. So any credentials that you're sharing, any connections you're making to, for example, right now, switch to my local SQL, the way it's connected, it's all happening locally. So none of that information is going out through the internet. and any of your data that you're using is not getting transmitted. So even when we were looking at the CSV file before, so this CSV file we were looking at before, none of this data is actually going into the internet. The only thing that's being shared with the LLM right now is information in this file, so the schema, right? So, and the source will be the SQL Server name. What is the database name called? What is the table name? What is the column name? Data type and specific values and node level, etc. So this is the information that can be useful for the LLM to generate queries that can be more accurate, more helpful, but it is not accessing any detailed data. Now, for some uses, even this information might be too sensitive, like even the table name or the column name too sensitive, in which case don't use it. Maybe, as I mentioned in the future, I do want to explore adding something like a Llama 3 so that you can run it completely offline, in which case, nothing gets shared. But right now, this schema does get shared, so keep that in mind. And this is pretty tedious to add by hand. So what we have here is some SQL code, some sample SQL code, and this is what it looks like here. So if you open that code, this is what it looks like. There's a couple of things you have to do once you open it. Number one, you connect it to the database you want to generate the schema off, right? So I have a few databases here. So let's say I want to use Chinook, which is this famous database of artists and musical artists and tracks and sales and so forth. And then there's a couple of inputs. One is how many sample values do I want to include? So these are values like, for example, here, album title. So there are 3 sample titles for this column. This allows the LLM to understand a little bit better what's in each column by giving it some sample values. But if, let's say, you don't want to do that, you can just set this to 0, in which case you'll just have column. So if I rerun it, you just have column names and table names. You don't have any sample values. So this is up to you, what you want to do here. And then if adding some description about the database can be helpful. So this database is about musical artists, tracks, and sales. Okay. So something like that. And then I run it, and then I can copy this information and basically come here and paste it in. So let me kind of go to, since I already have it here, I'll paste over it. So I just wanted to show you how to do that, even though it's fairly simple. So this is not fancy at all. As you can see, it's a fairly simple way to do it. And so, that's all you do. And for the next database that you want to add, you just add it to the bottom of it as well. And then you can save this file and close out of it. And that's it. So now I've given VerbaGPT the context that it would need. And let's see it in action. So I'm going to select Chinook here and go to the talk page. So now it's telling me that's connected to this SQL Server, that database. And I'm going to ask it a question. How many artists are there in the data? Okay. So the hope here is that it can write some SQL code and give us the answer from the data set that I just connected to it. So it's telling me what it's using, the SQL Server, what database, and what table. So that it found that there's a table called artist that might have the question that I want. So I didn't give it the table name. I just gave it the database. And so there are 275 artists in the data. Okay. Well, what if I don't even give it the database? Let's say I'm a new analyst at a company. I don't know how things are organized. I just have the server name and I have an interesting question I want to ask. And by asking that question and generating some draft code, maybe I can get a sense of how things are organized, assuming somebody else has done the work of the schema, putting together the schema in the company and is maintaining it. So let's say get the total sales by country of customer, then plot this data on a world map. This is a complex kind of a query. It has to do a few things here. It has to find out the right database, because I didn't give it the database. I just gave it the server. So it did find the right database. This will not always work, but it worked here. It has to find the right tables. It has to do some joins here. It has to figure out what total sales means. And then it has to try to plot it on the world map. And I clicked on execute here. And there we have it. We have our query answered in this case. So at the end, I know this video is getting long. I'll just talk briefly about what the vision is for something like this in the future that I see, and what it currently is. So, what is this good for today, and where can this technology go in the future? Just very quickly, I think the vision for VerbaGPT that I had in my mind was that the speed at which information flows in an organization is severely throttled today, because there's lots of domain expertise, but then there's a much smaller number of people who know how to write code, right, and do analysis and do all that stuff. So the way the information can be extracted from the data that is in companies, everyone talks about how data is the most important asset today. Well, yes, it is, but the way it's utilized is highly inefficient, because the domain experts cannot really access the data easily. So the idea is that one day, anybody in an organization can just ask a question, and depending on what permissions are available, just like on my laptop, if there's a SQL server that's available to me on my network, it'll grab it. Then that question can be answered. The LLM can take care of the right databases, the right tables, et cetera, et cetera. And that sounds wonderful, but we are clearly not there today. Why? Because there's a number of issues. I'll go through it very, very quickly. Hallucinations are sort of mitigated, because we are not generating sort of detailed summaries here. We're generating code. So if it generates bad code, it hallucinates a table name or column name or something. The code is just not going to run. So that problem is mitigated. But there are other bigger problems, because it may not understand user intent. Schemas are messy in organizations. So there might be tables that are similarly named or columns that are similarly named, which mean very different things. So unless you're going through and giving it the schema with the notes like I showed, unless somebody's doing that, then it can easily give the wrong answer. The code will execute, it'll give the answer, and then it can be misleading. So there's that big problem. Okay, so I told you about the vision. I also told you about that it's not there today. So what is this good for? I think this is good for, as I mentioned on the download page, it's good for exploring. The idea is that one day the technology will get to the level that I'm talking about in my vision. And then to prepare for that, I think it's good to play with some of these technologies. So that's I think, the intent of this is that this is a good exploratory tool, good educational tool, that you can use it to sort of play with these LLMs and see how good or bad they are at generating code. And can be a useful tool, can be save some time in drafting queries. You can do some modeling, which I think there are videos on the website on how you can create some models using the schema of the data that you have, like random forests and decision trees and neural network models and so forth. Some kind of modeling. So that's can be useful, because it can write a whole bunch of code for you that you can repurpose. You can kind of copy this code and put it in your Jupyter notebook or something and edit it as well. Yeah, of course, I think one of the things, this is not a SaaS product, so it does run locally, as I mentioned. So no data actually leaves your hardware. which is useful, at least as I think about these things, because there are some tools out there that are really good, but they're SaaS based. So that's something to think about as well. Anyway, this video has already gone too long. Thank you for watching. If you have any comments, please write below, and I'll try to address them and answer them as well. And if you have any thoughts about how we can improve this in the future, do let me know that as well. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.